Some men are remembered for the wars they won. My grandfather was remembered for the one duel he refused to fight, and for the granddaughter who stood in the dust where he should have stood and would not move. I've told this story maybe 40 times in my life, and I've never once told it the same way because I've never once understood it the same way. When you're young, you think it's a story about courage. Then you get older and you think it's a story about a girl too proud to run. And then you get older still, and one gray morning you finally see it plain. It was never about the duel at all. It was about what a person will carry so that someone they love doesn't have to. Stay with me. I'm going to tell you about a 14-year-old girl named Wren Callahan who walked out into a killing ground meant for an old man, and about the gunfighter who came to collect a debt written in another man's blood. I was there. I saw her hands shake. I saw what she did with those shaking hands. And I'm telling you, by the end, the whole town was different, and so was I. Let me take you back. The morning it happened, the frost hadn't burned off the water troughs yet, and I remember that because I was the one who broke the ice with the butt of my rifle so the horses could drink. And I remember thinking that the crack of it was too loud, that it carried too far in the still air, like the whole valley was holding its breath and I just interrupted something. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's a habit of mine. I keep a log, have for 30 years, a little oilcloth book I write the weather in, and the price of feed, and sometimes things I've got no business writing down because there's nobody to read them but me. My name's Elias Barrow. I was 41 that autumn, foreman of the Callahan spread, and I was not a brave man. I want that understood before I tell you the rest, because otherwise you'll think I'm making myself the hero of a thing where the hero was a child. The Callahan place sat in a fold of the hills west of a town called Amity Springs, which was a joke of a name for a town that had buried 9 men in 2 years, but nobody was laughing anymore by then. Old Thomas Callahan had built the ranch up from nothing 40 years before, back when the land would kill you for looking at it wrong. By the autumn I'm telling you about, he was 73, and his hands had gone to knots, and he couldn't hold a cup steady enough to drink his own coffee without both of them wrapped around it. Wren used to hold it for him some mornings and pretend she was just warming her fingers on the mug. She was his granddaughter. Her folks, Thomas's son and the boy's wife, had died of the fever when Wren was 6, and the old man had raised her himself, clumsy and fierce, the way an old bull will stand over a calf. She was 14 that autumn, and she was all elbows and stubbornness, hair the color of dry corn silk that never stayed in its braid, and a way of looking at you sideways when she decided you were wrong but was still deciding whether you were worth the argument. She could ride anything with legs. She could not, I'll tell you now, shoot worth a damn, and that matters, so hold on to it. The trouble came riding in on a Tuesday. I was mending the corral gate when I saw the dust, one rider coming slow, and slow was worse than fast. Fast meant a man with news. Slow meant a man who wanted you to watch him arrive, who wanted the fear to have time to work in you before he ever opened his mouth. I set down my hammer. I didn't pick up the rifle. I've thought about that 100 times since whether things would have gone different if I had, and I've decided they wouldn't have. But a man tells himself all kinds of things to sleep. The rider was named Cole Dunmore. I didn't know that yet, but the whole territory would know it by winter. He was maybe 35, lean as a whip, with a face that had been handsome once, and had since been sanded down to something harder by whatever he'd done to earn the 2 low-slung pistols he wore. He had a way of sitting a horse like he'd never once in his life been in a hurry to be anywhere. When he stopped at the gate, he looked at me and looked past me at the house, and he said, "I'm looking for Thomas Callahan." "He's not receiving," I said. Dunmore smiled. It was a patient smile. "He'll receive me." I'll tell you what I learned over the next terrible hour, though I learned it in pieces and out of order, the way you learn everything that matters. 22 years before, Thomas Callahan had killed a man named Silas Dunmore in a dispute over water rights. Killed him fair, in the open, in front of witnesses, when Silas drew first. That's the truth of it, and everyone alive who'd seen it swore to the same. But Silas Dunmore had a son, and that son had spent 22 years growing up on a single story his mother told him at night, and in her version there was no drawing first, no fairness, only a Callahan who'd murdered his daddy for a creek. The boy had become a gunfighter. He'd killed 11 men that anyone could count, and he'd come at last to close the book. "Tell him," Dunmore said, still smiling, still patient, "that Silas Dunmore's boy is in Amity Springs. Tell him I'll be in the street in front of the church day after tomorrow at noon. He can meet me there like a man, or I'll come out here and I'll burn everything he ever built with him inside it. His choice." He touched his hat. "Nice place he's got. Be a shame." Then he turned his horse and rode off, slow, the same way he'd come. I went inside and I told the old man because there was nothing else to do. Thomas Callahan sat at his table with his ruined hands flat on the wood, and he listened, and when I was done he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I remember his father. Silas was a fool, but he didn't deserve a boy who'd waste his life on this." "You can't meet him, Thomas." I said it flat. "You can't hold a gun. He'll kill you where you stand and call it justice, and there's not a law within 200 miles that'll say otherwise." "I know it," he said. "Then we fight him here, me and the hands. We fort up we." "You'll do no such thing." His voice cracked like the ice on the trough. "I'll not have men die for my old sins, Elias. It was my quarrel. It was always my quarrel." He looked at his hands like they belonged to someone else. "I'll go to town. I'll stand in the street. And I'll die there, and maybe that's the debt paid, and maybe the boy rides off and troubles no one again." He said it calm. He decided. I knew that calm. It was the same calm Wren got. I didn't hear her in the doorway. I don't know how long she'd been there. I only knew when she spoke, and her voice was doing the thing a voice does when a person is holding themselves together with both hands. "No," Wren said. The old man's head came up. "Wren." "No." She came into the room. She was shaking. I could see it from across the room, the fine tremor in her, but she came in anyway, and she stood at the table and she said, "You didn't do anything wrong. Everybody says so. Everybody who was there says his daddy drew first. It's not you don't get to just—" And here her voice broke clean in half, and she pushed through it, which is a thing I will remember about her until I die, the way she pushed through it. "You don't get to just go die because some man tells a lie loud enough. It's not about the lie, child." "Then what's it about?" "It's about a boy who lost his father," Thomas said quietly, "and a man who owes him at least the honesty of standing still while he settles it." And Wren Callahan looked at her grandfather for a long moment, and something moved behind her face that I didn't understand until it was far, far too late, and she said, "All right," just that. "All right." And she left the room, and I was fool enough, God help me, to think she'd given in. She hadn't given in. She'd started planning. Here is what I didn't know that night and pieced together after. Wren went to the bunkhouse and she woke up old Pharaoh, the horsebreaker, who was the only one of us who'd ever been a soldier, and she asked him a question, and the question was, if a man has to stand in a duel and that man can't win, is there any way for him to lose slow, to make it last, to make the other man work? And Pharaoh, who loved that girl like his own, asked her why in God's name she wanted to know, and she told him. And Pharaoh was quiet, the way we were all quiet that autumn, and then he told her the truth, because Pharaoh never lied to her, not once, not ever. He told her there was no way, that a duel wasn't a thing you survived by being clever. It was a thing you survived by being faster, and she wasn't faster, and she never would be. "Then teach me to be slower than I look," Wren said. I don't know everything they did in that barn over the next day and a half. I know Pharaoh taught her one thing, and one thing only, because it was the only thing that fit in the time they had. He couldn't teach her to win, so he taught her to make a man hesitate. Because here's the secret Pharaoh knew, that he'd learned in a war he never talked about. A man who kills for a living can shoot another man who's trying to kill him, easy, quick, without a flicker. That's the job. But a man like Cole Dunmore, a man who'd built his whole self around the story that he was righteous, that he was owed, that man had never once had to shoot someone who wasn't fighting back. And Pharaoh's terrible, brilliant, heartbreaking idea was this: you cannot win the duel, so do not fight the duel. Stand in it. Refuse it. Make him choose in front of the whole town, in front of God, between his revenge and his lie. Make him look at what he's really become. It was the worst plan I ever heard. It depended entirely on Cole Dunmore having a soul left. And Wren Callahan, 14 years old with hands that shook, decided to bet her life that he did. I found out the morning of. I found out because I went to saddle the old man's horse and Wren was already in the barn, and she was wearing her grandfather's long coat, the gray one, the one that hung to her boots and made her look, from a distance, from across a wide, dusty street, to a man who'd never seen either of them up close, near enough to an old man's size that a fearful town might not know the difference until she turned around. "Wren," my voice didn't sound like mine. "Wren, what are you doing?" She turned around. She'd been crying and she'd stopped, and her face had that terrible calm, and she said, "He raised me. He's got nobody else and I've got nobody else, and I'm not going to stand in that yard and wave while he rides off to get shot." She swallowed. "You're going to help me, Elias, or you're going to stop me, and if you stop me you'd better lock me in the cellar and hold the door, because otherwise I'll just walk to town on my own 2 feet." And I looked at that child in her grandfather's coat, and I thought about every brave thing I had never done in my whole cautious life, and I want to tell you I made a noble choice. I didn't. I made no choice at all. I just followed her, because I could not, in that moment, think of a single thing in the world worth more than making sure she was not alone when she got where she was going. We rode to Amity Springs in the cold. She didn't talk. Neither did I. About a mile out she reached over without looking and gripped my sleeve, just for a second, the way she used to when she was small and the thunder scared her, and then she let go and squared herself in the saddle and never touched me again. And that little grab of my sleeve, I've got a note about it in my log, 3 words, she held on. That's the thing that broke me. Not the duel, that. Noon in Amity Springs, and the whole town had come out to watch a man die. They didn't know which man yet. That's the thing about a town. It'll turn out for a killing the way it'll turn out for a hanging or a wedding, hungry and ashamed of itself for being hungry. They lined the boardwalks. They stood in doorways. Mothers held their children and didn't send them inside, which tells you something about people I've never liked knowing. The church stood white at the end of the street with its little crooked steeple, and in front of it, in the middle of the road, stood Cole Dunmore, and he had been standing there since before we arrived. Patient, always patient. A man who had waited 22 years and could wait 22 minutes more. Wren got down off her horse at the far end of the street. I stayed mounted. That was the plan, her plan that she'd told me in the last mile, low and fast. I was to stay back. I was not to draw. No matter what happened, she said, no matter what, I was not to draw, because the whole point, the entire fragile point of the thing, was that nobody on the Callahan side was fighting. If I drew, it became a gunfight, and Dunmore would win a gunfight, and worse, it would let him off. It would let him tell himself he'd been in a battle. She would not give him a battle. She would give him a choice and nothing else, and make him live inside it. She walked up the middle of the street in her grandfather's gray coat, and from behind she was an old man, stooped a little, moving slow, and I heard the town murmur and settle. There he is, there's Callahan, the old man's come after all. And Cole Dunmore's hand drifted down near his gun, and he called out in that patient, carrying voice, "Thomas Callahan, you came. I didn't think you would." And he sounded, I'll swear to this, almost relieved, like a man glad the long thing was finally ending. And Wren stopped, 30 feet from him in the middle of the road, and she turned around. I have tried for 30 years to describe the sound that street made when it saw her face. It wasn't a gasp. It was worse than a gasp. It was a kind of low collective flinch, the sound of 200 people understanding something ugly all at once, because it was a child. It was a girl. It was a 14-year-old with cornsilk hair coming loose from its braid, standing in an old man's coat in a killing ground, and she was not holding a gun. Her hands were empty. She'd left the gun with me. That was hers too, that last piece, and she hadn't told me till we got there. And when she'd handed me her grandfather's pistol, her hands were shaking so hard the cylinder rattled, and she'd said, If I'm holding it, he can shoot me and be right. If I'm not, he can only shoot me and be what he is." Cole Dunmore stared at her. "Where's Callahan?" he said. His voice had changed. The patience was cracking. "Girl, where is he? This is his coat." "He's home," Wren said, loud enough for the whole street. Her voice shook and she let it shake. She didn't fight it anymore, she just spoke over the shaking. "He's home because he's an old man who can't hold a cup, and you knew that. Everybody knew that. You came here to shoot a man who can't lift his own arm and call it justice for your daddy." She took a breath. "Your daddy drew first. There's men right here on this street who saw it. Turn around and ask them. Go on, ask them." Nobody moved, but I saw heads drop. I saw a man named Hollies, who'd been there 22 years ago. I saw him look at his own boots, and Dunmore saw it too. "You don't know anything about it," Dunmore said, but his hand had come away from his gun. "I know my grandfather cried about it," Wren said, and her voice finally broke all the way, and she let it. She stood there and let 200 people watch her cry and did not wipe her face. "I know he says your daddy's name in his sleep. I know he'd have taken it back 40 times over if he could. He didn't send me. He doesn't even know I'm here. He's home right now getting ready to ride out and let you kill him because he thinks he owes you that, because he spent 22 years thinking he owes your family something. And you," she pointed at him and her arm was shaking, and she pointed anyway, "you're going to take that from a man who's already sorry. That's your justice. Shoot me then. I'm a Callahan. I'm all the Callahan that's going to stand in this street. Shoot me and go home and tell your mother you finally did it." And Cole Dunmore stood there in the noon light with a whole town watching, and he had spent his entire life becoming a man who could do exactly one thing, and that thing was standing in front of him in the shape of a crying child with empty hands, and he could not do it. I watched it happen on his face. I've never seen anything like it before or since. I watched 22 years of a story a grieving mother told a little boy at night just come apart. Because he'd built himself into an instrument of justice, and justice doesn't shoot children, and if he shot her he was not justice. He was just a man who'd murdered a girl in the street, and everyone would know it. And worst of all, he would know it forever, for whatever was left of his life. His hand was shaking now too, 2 people in a street shaking. "Move," he said to her. It came out broken. "Girl, get out of the street, go home." "No," Wren said. "I'll count to 3. "You can count to 100, she said. "I'm not moving and you're not shooting me because you're not what your mother made you into. I can see it. Everybody can see it. You're just a boy who misses his daddy." And she said softer, so soft I almost didn't hear it, but the street was so silent that everyone did. "I miss mine too." Cole Dunmore made a sound. I won't try to write down what kind of sound. It's not the kind of thing that goes in a log. It was the sound of something 22 years old finally dying, and it did not die easy. He holstered his gun. He did it clumsy, his hand not working right. And then Cole Dunmore, who had killed 11 men, turned around in the middle of Amity Springs and walked to his horse with his back to a Callahan, which is a thing no gunfighter does. A thing that meant he no longer cared whether he lived, and he mounted up, and he looked at Wren one more time from the saddle. His face was wet too. I want that in the record. His face was wet too. "Tell him," Dunmore said, and stopped and started again. "Tell your grandfather." And he couldn't finish it. He just shook his head and turned his horse and rode out of town slow, the same way he'd ridden into all our lives, and nobody ever saw him again in that territory, and I have wondered every year since whether he found something to be, out there, that wasn't the thing his grief had built. Wren stood in the empty street until he was gone. And then her legs went out from under her, all at once, like a puppet with the strings cut, and I was off my horse and across that street faster than I've ever moved in my life, and I caught her before she hit the ground, and she was shaking so hard I thought she'd come apart in my arms, and she wasn't crying like before. She was crying like a child now, like the 14-year-old she was, huge and helpless, all the calm spent, all the courage spent. Just a scared girl who'd been brave past the very end of her bravery and had nothing left. And I held her there in the dirt in front of the whole town, and I said the only thing I could think of, over and over, which was, "You did it, you did it, You can stop now. You did it. We rode home in the last of the light. She slept most of the way, slumped against me, and I held the reins in one hand and held her with the other, and I did not once let go. Thomas Callahan was standing at the gate. He'd figured it out, of course he had. The coat was gone, the girl was gone. Pharaoh wouldn't meet his eye. He was standing at the gate in the cold with his ruined hands hanging at his sides, and a look on his face I hope to God I never see on another human being. And when he saw us coming, saw her alive against my chest, he made a sound, and his knees buckled, and Pharaoh caught him the way I'd caught her. I don't know everything the old man said to her that night. I gave them that. But I passed the door once later and I saw them at the table, and he had both her hands wrapped in both of his ruined ones, and he wasn't trying to warm them and he wasn't pretending anything. He was just holding on, and his shoulders were shaking, and she was the one saying it now, soft, the way you'd talk to a spooked horse. I couldn't hear the words. I didn't need to. That was 30 years ago. Wren Callahan runs the ranch now. She's got children of her own, and they can all of them ride anything with legs, and not one of them can shoot worth a damn, and she seems glad of that in a way I understand better than I used to. She doesn't talk about that autumn much. Once, only once, years later, I asked her if she'd been sure that day, in the street, if she'd known Dunmore wouldn't do it. She was quiet a long while. Then she said, "No, I wasn't sure of anything. I just knew I'd rather find out standing in front of my grandfather than watching from behind him." And she went back to what she was doing. I still keep my log. I'm an old man now myself, older than Thomas was that autumn, and my hands have started to go to knots, and some mornings I can't hold the cup. Wren comes by and holds it for me and pretends she's just warming her fingers. I never did tell her what I wrote in the log that day. The 3 words, the only thing I could get down that night with my hands still unsteady from catching her. She held on. I've thought a long time about what it means, and I think it means more than one thing, and I think that's right, and I think I'll leave it.